Most salespeople use a product selling approach, which focuses more on trying to sell the product to the prospect in every interaction. Even if you're on a cold call or sending a cold email and you actually can't close the deal and take the order right then, most salespeople still focus on the last step of the sales process of the prospect purchasing by asking the prospect if they're interested or if they need the product being sold. And there are many problems with that, some of which we've discussed already in other training modules. But one of the main problems with that is that closing the sale is usually not the next step when you're reaching out to prospects and performing cold outreach. And by having more awareness and clarity for these individual steps, it can become a lot more clear what best to say and do in all of the different interactions that you have with prospects. So what we're going to do in this training module is go through these 3 steps of the sales process, because each of these steps has its own goals and objectives. And by having more clarity for which step of the sales process you're at any given moment, and having more clarity for what you're trying to achieve in that exact moment and what you should say and ask, not only will you improve your performance as a salesperson, but selling will actually become easier. So starting with the first step of the sales process, we refer to this as the initial contact sales process step. And this is basically the first time that you're interacting with a prospect. And one of the most common ways that you might picture the initial contact is picking up the phone and cold calling a prospect. But the initial contact step could also be a cold email you send to the prospect. It could be meeting someone out at a networking event or meeting someone in different social situations. The initial contact could also be the prospect contacting you by calling your company or sending an email to your company through a contact us page on a website. Or it could be a prospect communicating with you or your company through a website chat. And certainly it could be interacting with prospects in different ways through social media. And when you're interacting with prospects at the initial contact step, you have very distinct goals. And the first goal to realize that you don't need to work on is selling your product. When you're sending your cold email, you do not need to see if the prospect wants to buy your product, because the purchase is not the next step in the sales process. The next step in the sales process is the conversation. So the main goal of the initial contact is to close the prospect on simply talking more. And that's all we need to focus on. And one way to find out if there's a reason and a justification in talking more is to pre-qualify the prospect by asking questions to identify if there is enough of a fit between the prospect's needs and what we have to offer to simply talk more. And we also do not need to make the prospect interested in buying our product or service at this particular point, because our goal is not to sell the product. We do want to work to make the prospect interested in who we are and what we sell or the company we work for, but we only need to build interest to get the prospect open to talking to us a little more in a longer conversation. The initial contact should be a very brief interaction with the prospect. It should only be between 2 to 5 minutes. If you've gone longer than that, you're either taking too much time or you've progressed the next step of the sales process. And what a lot of product selling salespeople do is they make the initial contact all about them. Their cold email will be all about their company and the product they sell, or on their cold call, they will talk a lot about their company and their product. And in the Smart Sales System, we actually want to flip that. Instead of making the initial contact all about you, we want to make the initial contact all about the prospect. So try to make the initial contact be 80% on the prospect and 20% on you. And a nice way to organize that is to make the beginning and the middle of the initial contact all about the prospect. And then after you've learned a little bit about them, bring it back to you and make the last 20% of the initial contact about you, and use that space to build interest. And then you close them for the next step of the sales process And the best way to make 80% of the initial contact about the prospect is by simply asking questions. There are only two types of questions that you need to worry about asking during the initial contact. The first type is pain questions. You're trying to find a reason to talk more, and one of the best ways to find a reason to talk more is by asking questions that look to see if the prospect has the pain points or the concerns or the challenges that your product or service can help to resolve. Another type that are good to ask during the initial contact step are current state questions. We'll talk more about these later, but current state questions help you to learn what's going on the prospect side, and these can also help you to pre-qualify the prospect to identify if it even makes sense for both parties to talk more, and these questions can also help you to find that justification and reason to talk more. So that is the initial contact step of the sales process. Ideally, at this point, we're either closing the prospect on talking more and moving to the next step, which is the conversation, or we're agreeing that it doesn't make sense to talk more and closing the file and moving on to find better prospects to spend our valuable time with. But for the prospects that we successfully close for talking more during the initial contact step, those prospects will then progress to the conversation step of the sales process, and that can typically look like having an appointment with a prospect. Could certainly be an online meeting. It could be meeting someone on another day for coffee. The conversation sales process step could also take place over the phone and even at the same time as a cold call. If you're out networking, you could certainly progress prospects to the conversation step at that same event. And once we get to the conversation step, our goals start to change. But we're still not at a point where our goal is to sell our product or service, because the purchase is still not the next step in our sales process. The next step in our sales process is the explanation step, where we are going to explain what we have to offer and how it can help or fit with the prospect. And so the goal of the conversation is to sell the prospect on spending more time with us, where we will explain what we have to offer. And at this step of the sales process, we are progressing from trying to pre-qualify the prospect to actually qualifying the prospect. Once you get to the conversation and you're considering progressing and spending maybe an hour with the prospect in the explanation step, you want to learn more about the prospect and try to figure out, is this someone worth me spending my valuable time with? And is this a real prospect that truly needs what I sell and is able to purchase what I sell? And it's our process of qualifying, which we will discuss in an upcoming training module in the Smart Sales System, that will help you to identify that. And in the conversation step, we want to continue to try to build more interest on the prospect side for what we have to sell, but we still don't need to make them interested enough to buy from us. We just need to make them interested enough so that they agree to move to the next step of learning more about what we have to offer. The conversation step could be anywhere between 10 to 60 minutes, usually dependent on how complex it is that you sell. That might impact how much you want to learn about the prospect and might impact how much you want to talk about what you sell. And that division of how much time you spend learning about the prospect and talking about what you have to offer, we recommend that becomes an equal distribution at the conversation step, with half of the time and attention on the prospect and the other half on you. A nice way to divide that is make the first half of the conversation and the meeting about the prospect by asking questions and learning about the prospect, and then make the second half of the meeting about you, sharing details about what you have to offer and possibly tailoring what you say according to the information you learned in the first half of the meeting. And the questions you ask in the first half of the conversation begin to change a little bit from the initial contact step. We could certainly ask any pain questions, current state questions. You might want to ask desired state questions to learn about where the prospect wants to go. Learn details about their organization if you're selling B2B. be, and certainly ask qualifying questions. But hopefully for some of your prospects, you successfully close them at the end of your meeting and at the end of your conversation for talking more and them learning more about how you can help them. And then you progress to the explanation step, which is basically you explaining how your product or service can help them based on what you've learned about them. And this can usually take the form of some sort of presentation. It might be a demonstration. It could also be you providing a proposal or a quotation. There are some products and services that are commonly known, and there might not need to be a detailed presentation or demonstration. When that's the case, the explanation step might just be you flipping through a few different packages that the prospect can choose from and quoting the different pricing and packages that are available. And it's the explanation step where we actually progress our way towards the goal of selling the actual product and closing the prospect on agreeing to purchase. So hopefully you can see that we are a long way away at this point from the cold outreach, from the cold call, from the cold email. And now we are shifting to the goal that a lot of product selling salespeople have in those early interactions with the prospect. And in this sales process step, we might want to continue to qualify the prospect. We want to continue our effort to build the prospect's interest. And since our goal is to get the prospect to buy from us, we do want to try to build interest to a level where the prospect wants to move forward to that step of purchasing. And the explanation step could be anywhere between 30 minutes to 2 hours, depending on how complex the product or service that you sell is. And the distribution of attention is actually the exact opposite of what it was in the initial contact step. A nice way to organize this is the first 20% of the explanation can be about the prospect. Share with the prospect what you've learned from your conversations with them and from your research, and then spend the next 80% of the explanation talking about you and how you match up with their needs and their challenges and their interests. And so this is a good opportunity to ask any of the different categories of questions that you haven't had the opportunity to ask yet. And so those are the 3 steps of the sales process, and those 3 steps will fit with just about any product or service or industry. And when you look at those 3 steps, they may look like 3 separate steps that you would go through on 3 different days. And that can certainly be a good way to go through. But there are situations where you might go through these in different ways. For example, you could certainly go through the initial contact and have the conversation step actually occur in the same interaction. For example, you might cold call a prospect and end up talking to them for 20 or 30 minutes. Or you might meet a prospect at a networking event and you end up talking to them for 20 or 30 minutes. We actually refer to this type of scenario as an instant meeting. Now, there are some pros and cons to having instant meetings with prospects. So the first thing I would recommend is to be aware of when you are progressing into an instant meeting, because there are situations where you might want to prevent that from happening. So to understand that a little bit better, first, let's discuss when it is good to have instant meetings with prospects. And this can be when you're reaching out to a prospect that's really difficult to get a hold of, and you don't know if you're ever going to be able to get them on the phone or get in front of them again. You might just want to try to power through and get as much as you can out of that interaction. Another reason instant meetings might be good is if you're in a face-to-face scenario with a prospect and it's just easier to power through and try to get as much as you can done instead of stopping and meeting again on another day. Instant meetings also might be good if what you sell is not real complex, meaning you don't really have a lot of questions to ask and things to learn about from the prospect. And when that's the case, you can kind of squeeze those 2 sales process steps together. Or an instant meeting might be good if the prospect is really wanting to move quickly and not wanting to wait a few days or a week before moving on to the next step and talking more. But in most cases, I recommend avoiding the instant meeting. And when you're on a call and a prospect is asking you questions, it can be real easy to accidentally just flow into an instant meeting. And the next thing you know, you've been talking to the prospect for 20 to 30 minutes and have answered a lot of their questions. The problem with that is that you usually will get more time and attention with the prospect if you draw a line between the initial contact and schedule a more formal appointment and meeting on another day with the prospect. And another thing that can do is that can also help both you and the prospect to become more prepared for what to ask and what to talk about by stopping and then regrouping and meeting again on another day. The other downside to accidentally flowing into an instant meeting is that can often happen when the prospect is responsive and asking you questions. And that might feel really good to you, and you answer their questions, and the next thing you know, you've talked for a little bit and you've fallen into an instant meeting. In that case, what happens is that you end up missing a closing opportunity by answering the prospect's questions and giving them the information they need. When a prospect is curious and asks you questions, what you can do is you can draw the line there between the instant contact and the conversation and use their curiosity and their questions as a reason to talk more on another day by saying something like, you know what, that's a really good question. And the answer is a bit of a long discussion. So what do you think about stopping here? And what we can do is we can schedule a meeting next Tuesday, and I can actually bring some people into the meeting that can talk about that subject in more detail. And then we can answer any other questions you might have. Does that sound fair? So by saying that, you're preventing the instant meeting and closing the prospect on the next step of your sales process. And most likely in that scenario, you'll get more time and attention with the prospect in that next meeting. The same thing can actually happen with the explanation step. And what this might look like is you're having your appointment, you're asking the prospect some questions, and when you get to sharing some information about you, you might end up throwing up some slides about your product or your company, or giving the prospect some brochures or showing a quick demonstration. And that's what we refer to as an instant explanation. And the same factors apply here, where there might be times where it's best to do this depending on what you sell or depending on the situation, with you already being in the prospect's office and already sitting there. But in most cases, you might benefit from separating those steps on other days by getting more time and attention with the prospect. And there's another scenario where you might be looking at these 3 steps and thinking, this really doesn't apply to you because what you sell is very simple and usually sold through what is sometimes referred to as a one-call close, where you call up a prospect and there is no sales process. You try to close them right there in that one interaction. And I would actually argue that even if that's the case, you can still go through these 3 sales process steps in one complete interaction. For example, let's say that you cold call a prospect and you talk to them for a couple minutes and ask them a question or two. That's the initial contact step. Then they give you a good answer, and then you close them on talking for another 5 to 10 minutes to learn a little bit more about them. And what you did there is you've just progressed to the conversation sales process step, where you're learning more about the prospect. And based on what you've learned about them, they actually fit with the product or service that you sell. And then you present to them 3 of the different packages that you have to offer. You've just progressed to the explanation step. What you've done there is you've gone through each of these sales process steps in one complete interaction, and we would refer to that as a one-call close, and that includes all of these steps in the same call. And I'm biased, but I believe that organizing a call and trying to do a one-call close using these 3 steps would not only help you to be more successful, it would actually make it easier for you to manage and control those phone calls with your prospects. So that is the 3-step sales process, and hopefully that simplifies your selling efforts and helps you to generate more leads and more successfully move prospects through your sales process. And if you're a person that likes to learn by using acronyms and using acronyms to remember different concepts, an acronym you can use for this 3-step sales process is ICE, by taking the first letter of each step. So if you want to be a very cool, calm salesperson that knows exactly what to do at each moment when you're interacting with prospects, then what you can do is you can use the ICE sales process. And that is pretty much it. The next module in the Smart Sales System is module 6, where we will talk about our process for cold calling. If you have questions or want more information, the best place to go is salescriptor.com. Thanks for being here. Hope this was helpful, and we look forward to seeing you on the next video. Have a great day. Take care. Bye.